Okay, let's go. Number 1. Actun Tunichil Muknal. To get there, you hike 45 minutes through lowland jungle, cross 3 flooded passages in cold black water that reaches your waist, and enter in total darkness. The Belizean jungle is loud insects, birds, water moving over stone. The cave swallows all of it. Inside, silence, cold, and the smell of deep limestone. The kind of silence that does not feel neutral. The site is called Actun Tunichil Muknal. In Yucatec Maya, the name translates to Cave of the Crystal Sepulchre. The translation appeared in the early documentation for the Belize Valley Archaeological Reconnaissance Project, the BVAR, which began systematic survey of the cave system in 1989 under the direction of Dr. Jamie Aw of the University of New South Wales. At the time of initial survey, 14 skeletal remains had been identified inside the cave, ranging from infants to adults. Perimortem fractures to the cranium fractures, sustained at or near the time of death, documented through surface morphology of the break, were confirmed across multiple individuals. The Journal of Anthropological Research published osteological findings on the material consistent with ritual defleshing, the deliberate removal of soft tissue from bone as a ceremonial act conducted after death. This was the Terminal Classic period, 700 to 900 CE. The lowland Maya civilization was not declining, it was collapsing, on a timescale of decades, driven by documented drought cycles, agricultural failure, and intercity warfare that dismantled the political infrastructure across a region the size of France. The BVAR analysis, corroborated by regional ceramic stratigraphy, established that the skeletal depositions at Actun Tunichil Muknal clustered in this period. The sacrifices were crisis response. They were not routine ceremony. Someone brought these people or brought themselves into the flooded dark because something catastrophic was underway, and the standard petition procedures had failed to produce a result. The most photographed feature of the cave is a calcified skeleton in the inner chamber. The calcification is real. Over centuries, calcium carbonate from the cave water has infiltrated the bones until they appear to grow from the rock itself, the surfaces glittering under torchlight, mineral encrusted, fused into the cave floor as though the cave had decided to keep what was brought to it. The skeleton became known as the Crystal Maiden, a name that circulated widely in travel journalism and archaeological tourism, reproduced on booking websites and documentary narration, before the remains were subjected to modern osteological reanalysis. The reanalysis found a male, approximately 18 years of age. The pelvis morphology, the cranial architecture, the long bone metrics, all male. The name is wrong. The gender assignment it implies is wrong. The story built around a sacrificed young woman in a crystal cave, that story is wrong. What persists is the calcite, which does not care what it has been called. In 2012, a tourist stepped on a 1,000-year-old skull. It shattered. The skull had survived the Terminal Classic, the Spanish Conquest, 4 centuries of colonial Belize, and the entire modern history of the country. It did not survive a guided tour. Cameras were permanently banned from the cave following that incident. Photographs no longer leave with visitors. The cave now resists documentation in a way the Maya architects of the depositions could not have anticipated and might have found appropriate. The BVAR project identified 2 mass deposition events in the skeletal record, 2 separate episodes in which bodies were brought to the cave in quantity, not accumulated over years, but delivered in concentrated events. Several individuals had been moved after initial deposition, post-mortem relocation, bodies repositioned within the cave to new coordinates. The ceramic assemblage associated with the skeletal material includes polychrome pottery, high status, painted, expensive, deliberately smashed. Termination deposits. The Maya practice of ritually ending an object's used life, or a building's functional period, or a catastrophe requiring spiritual intervention. The ceramics were destroyed on purpose. Their destruction was the point. Cave of the Crystal Sepulchre. Nobody thought to ask what a sepulchre needs to be crystal. The sacrifices cluster at the exact chronological midpoint of the collapse. People descended into a flooded cave system with bodies and smashed their finest painted pottery in the dark. Whether they believed it would work, whether those responsible expected the rain to return, the wars to stop, the harvest to recover, that cannot be answered by any data currently in the archaeological record. The outcome of the collapse is known. The lowland Maya civilization did not survive the terminal classic in its classic form. What the people in that cave believed in the moment they were doing it is not recorded anywhere. The calcite keeps growing over the bones. The name Crystal Maiden keeps circulating. The 1,000-year-old skull is fragments on the cave floor, and whatever it could have told a forensic osteologist, it can no longer tell anyone. Number 2. Shanidar Cave. Ralph Selecki arrived in the summer of 1960 on behalf of Columbia University. The cave is in the Zagros Mountains, above the Greater Zab River, in what is now the Kurdistan region of northern Iraq. He was excavating a site flagged during survey as archaeologically significant. He did not anticipate what the sediment would produce. 10 Neanderthal burials. The largest concentration of Neanderthal remains at a single site anywhere in the fossil record, dated between 35,000 and 65,000 years before the present. 1 cave, 10 individuals. Each is catalogued as Shanidar I through X, representing partial or complete skeletal remains recovered from stratified Pleistocene sediment. The burial designated Shanidar IV became the most consequential. The sediment matrix, immediately surrounding the skeleton, contained an anomalously dense concentration of pollen from 8 distinct plant species in quantities that could not be explained by wind, transport, or animal activity under standard taphonomic models. Arlette Leroy-Gourhan, palynologist at the Musée de l'Homme in Paris, analyzed the pollen assemblage. Her findings were published in Science in 1975. The pattern was consistent with intentional placement of flowering plants on or around the body at the time of burial. Her conclusion, stated with appropriate scientific caution, was that Shanidar IV had been buried with flowers. Seletsky published a book in 1971 before the Leroy-Gourhan analysis was complete. Shanidar, the first flower people. The argument was direct. If Neanderthals buried their dead with flowers, they possessed a concept of grief. Grief implies consciousness of death as a distinct event. Consciousness of death implies something recognizable as interior life. The book was widely read. The idea entered the general culture. For roughly 40 years, Shanidar was the evidence that grief predates Homo sapiens, that we did not invent mourning, that something older than us had already done it. Geoffrey Summer, writing in the Cambridge Archaeological Journal in 1999, looked more carefully at the rodents. A species of burrowing rodent, the Persian Jurd Mariones persicus, is endemic to the region and is documented at the site. Jurds construct burrow systems and cache plant material, including seeds and flowering heads, in underground chambers adjacent to their runs. Sommer's argument: the pollen clusters attributed to flower burial could be explained entirely by Jurd burrowing activity in the sediment layers above and adjacent to the skeleton. The grief may never have happened. The flowers may never have been placed. What Leroy-Gourhan identified as ceremony may have been storage. Emma Pomeroy, at the University of Cambridge, led a new excavation of Shanidar beginning in 2015. Her team recovered a new partial Neanderthal skeleton in 2019 designated Shanidar Z from the same cluster as Shanidar IV. The findings were published in Antiquity in 2020 and extended in PLOS One in 2023. Shanidar Z was in articulated condition, bones still in anatomical position, indicating burial before full decomposition, not secondary deposition of already defleshed remains. The pollen association at the cluster site was confirmed again. Pomeroy's work did not settle the debate. It made it more complicated. Shanidar I is the individual the excavation team called Old Man. The skeletal pathologies are specific: traumatic injury or congenital defect to the right eye socket consistent with partial or total blindness on that side, the right arm withered, the humerus reduced in girth from disuse, amputated below the elbow at some point before death, a fused knee joint on the right side, degenerative joint disease throughout the vertebral column, that right arm reduced, atrophied, ended at the elbow, is the physical record of years of accommodation by the group around him. Estimated age at death, 40 to 50 years. Very old for Neanderthals under Pleistocene conditions. Shanidar: I could not have survived those injuries without sustained care. Sustained care means deliberate choice. Deliberate choice to maintain a severely disabled individual for years means something about the social organization of the group that cannot be erased by the Jurd hypothesis. Shanidar III is the same cave, different individual. The rib cage shows a penetrating wound consistent with a thrusting implement, entering between the ribs at an angle that rules out accident. This is potentially the oldest documented evidence of intentional interpersonal violence in the hominin fossil record. Care for the disabled. Violence against the body, both present, both documented, both requiring interpretation, and both resisting it. The cave is in a war zone. The Kurdistan region has been subject to conflict intermittently since the 1980s. Shanidar sits within a seismically active zone. At least one collapse event is documented in the stratigraphic record, an event that killed some of the cave's occupants in situ. The rockfall layer is part of the excavated profile. Whatever remains unexcavated below Shanidar IV and Shanidar Z, and based on deposit density, there is reason to believe more exist, may stay in the sediment for decades, before conditions allow return. 40 years ago, this was the proof that grief is older than language. Then someone looked more carefully at the rodent tunnels. The question has not been answered since. Number 3. Dunmore Cave. The Annals of the Four Masters are a 17th century chronicle compiled by Franciscan friars from older Irish manuscripts, and they record an event from 928 CE in language that leaves little ambiguity. A Viking leader named Godfrey descended on the cave at Dunmore with his forces. 1,000 people were killed inside. That is what the annals say. 1,000 people. One cave. One event. The entry is brief. It does not explain what 1,000 people were doing in one cave in County Kilkenny, or how long it took, or whether any of them were counted. The Irish Office of Public Works conducted the first systematic excavation in 1973. 44 skeletal remains. The demographic profile was specific. Predominantly subadult individuals, children and adolescents, and adult females. No adult males were found among the recovered remains. The absence is not incidental. It shaped the interpretation entirely. The working reconstruction. Adult males died defending the approach, escaped through terrain that permitted it, or were captured and removed. The women and children went into the cave. The cave was the plan. The cave was where safety was supposed to be. The cave produced something else. Viking silver. Decorated arm rings, hack silver, which is silver cut from larger objects and hoarded by weight rather than form, and Hiberno-Norse material datable by typology and ornamental style to the 10th century CE. The silver was found beneath the bones. The people who entered the cave were connected to Hiberno-Norse trade networks. They brought what was portable and what had value and concealed it in the sediment of the lower passages. Then they could not retrieve it. Nobody came back for the arm rings. The silver remained, and across 11 centuries the bones settled over it. There is no confirmed peri-mortem weapon trauma on the majority of the recovered remains. This matters considerably. Cut marks on bone, blunt force lesions on crania, penetrating injuries to the rib cage. These signatures survive for centuries and are legible to a trained forensic osteologist. The Dunmore bones do not carry those signatures in the pattern that direct massacre produces. Elizabeth O'Brien, of the Discovery Programme Ireland, published the most comprehensive skeletal analysis of the Dunmore material in the Journal of Irish Archaeology in 2003. Her assessment was precise. The spatial distribution of remains was inconsistent with secondary deposition, inconsistent with bodies moved into the cave after death. The positioning was consistent with people who had retreated into the cave's interior and died where they stopped. Not placed, not arranged, hiding, then not moving. The working hypothesis, consistent with the demographic distribution and O'Brien's spatial analysis, is asphyxiation, smoke inhalation. Fires set at the cave entrance by Godfrey's forces. The mechanism requires no contact. You do not need to enter a cave to kill everyone inside it. You need a fire at the mouth and patience. The people inside did not die quickly from blade wounds. They died from the air. The cave that was supposed to protect them became sealed around them. The arm rings under the floor were the last thing they put down. Dunmore Cave is a heritage site. Europe's largest freestanding stalagmite is here, a formation called the Market Cross, 17 feet high, built by calcium carbonate, accumulating at roughly 1 cubic centimeter per century. Guided tours run seasonally. The back chamber, where the skeletal material was concentrated, is interpreted for visitors. The cave has a website with ticket prices and school group rates. The Viking silver is in a museum. The demographic question has not been resolved. 44 bodies, women and children. The annals said 1,000. The archaeology doesn't contradict that. 44 confirmed. 956 unaccounted for. The annals figure of 1,000 is a medieval chronicle number. Such figures frequently communicate scale rather than precision and are not forensic tallies. But the cave has not been fully excavated. Passages beyond the 1973 survey footprint have not been examined with modern methods. Ground-penetrating radar, systematic flotation, phased grid excavation. What those chambers contain is not part of the current record. The demographic skew of the 44, combined with the silver concealed beneath the bones and never retrieved, suggests a population that did not survive long enough to collect what it had hidden. The count of 44 is the count of what was found. It is not the count of what is there. Nobody knows how many are still in the cave. Number 4. Loltun Cave. There is a face at the entrance. Carved in low relief directly into the limestone, a warrior, in profile, staring outward from the cave wall with an expression that holds something between authority and patience. The carving has never been dated with certainty. Stylistic analysis places it somewhere in a range spanning 1,200 years of Maya occupation. The person it depicts, the event it was meant to commemorate, the authority it was intended to represent, all gone. What remains is the face limestone weathered to the color of old bone, the profile sharp enough to read from 30 feet away, the date irrecoverable. Loltun is a Yucatec Maya compound. Lol, flower, tun, stone, stone flower. The system extends approximately 1.2 miles through the limestone karst of the Puuc region in northern Yucatan, a landscape riddled with caves, cenotes, and underground water systems that made sustained human habitation in an otherwise seasonally dry environment possible for millennia. 1.2 miles of catalogued passage, 1,600 feet of which have never been touched by a trowel. The Instituto Nacional de Antropología y Historia INAH conducted excavations between 1977 and 1985, directed by Eduardo Corona M. and associated researchers. What the stratigraphy produced was not what the cave's name, Grutas de Loltun, the grottos of the stone flower, prepares a visitor to expect: mammoth bones. Mammuthus columbi, the Columbian mammoth, recovered with cut marks consistent with butchery by stone tools. Horse remains, equus spo, in direct association with hearth features. Mastodon material. Radiocarbon and contextual dates, placing these deposits between 9,000 and 7,000 BCE, the late Pleistocene and early Holocene transition, when megafauna were disappearing from the peninsula. The people who used Loltun at that period were not Maya in any recognizable cultural sense. They were hunter-gatherers processing large animals in the entrance chambers of a cave that would later become a ceremonial center for a civilization those people could not have imagined. 3 distinct occupation phases are legible in the stratigraphy: Pleistocene, hunter-gatherer use, pre-classic Maya ceremonial activity, and terminal classic material, the same collapse horizon documented at Actun Tunichil Muknal in Belize. The terminal classic layer at Loltun includes human skeletal material with perimortem modification, disarticulation of the skeleton joint separation before decomposition is complete, and skull removal, consistent with patterns documented across other Maya ceremonial cave sites. The cave was not abandoned as the civilization contracted. It was used more intensively, for different purposes, at the moment of maximum crisis. Certain chambers in the cave produce tonal resonance at specific frequencies when sounds are made inside them, a property documented across multiple Mesoamerican cave and rock shelter sites. Stephen Waller published analysis of acoustics-based ritual space selection in the Journal of the Acoustical Society of America in 1993, arguing that pre-modern cultures systematically selected locations for ceremony based on acoustic properties, and that chambers producing pronounced resonance attracted ritual use across cultures and time periods. At Loltun, the chambers with the densest archaeological deposits are the chambers where the acoustic properties are most pronounced. Whether that correlation is causation, the record cannot determine, but it has been noticed, and noticing it changes what you hear when you stand in the resonant chambers and speak. Norberto González Crespo, working with INAH in 1977, documented what has been interpreted as a terminal classic violent event in one of the inner chambers: smashed ceramic vessels, charred organic material, and disarticulated human bone in deposit contexts inconsistent with ordinary refuse disposal. The pattern is consistent with deliberate termination, the same destruction visible at terminal classic sites across the lowland region. Someone ended something in that chamber. The record does not say what, but here is what that framing doesn't fully address. The cave recorded the drought that may have driven it all. A 2012 study by Lachniat and colleagues, published in Quaternary Science Reviews, analyzed speleothem isotopes from Loltun oxygen and carbon isotope signatures preserved in stalagmite growth layers, which function as paleoclimate proxies recording precipitation and temperature across time. The Loltun speleothems record the terminal classic drought, a prolonged arid interval through the 800 CE that correlates with the archaeological collapse horizon across the lowland Maya region. The drought is in the cave. The crisis the drought produced is in the cave. The bones that the crisis produced are in the cave. The stalagmites and the disarticulated human skeleton are in the same sediment sequence, in the same passages, in a system where 1,600 feet have never been excavated. Tourist lighting was installed in the accessible chambers decades ago. A guided path runs through the main galleries. Signs explain the mammoth bones and the Maya reliefs. At the entrance, the warrior face watches visitors arrive. It has no inscription. It has no confirmed date. Nobody looking at it knows with certainty when it was carved, who it depicts, or what it was meant to mark. Number 5. Lombrives Cave. Montségur fell in March of 1244. The Cathar stronghold in the Pyrenean foothills, the last significant fortified position of a theological movement, the Catholic Church had spent 4 decades trying to eradicate, surrendered after a 9-month siege. The Albigensian Crusade, authorized by Pope Innocent III in 1209, the first crusade directed against European Christians rather than external enemies, had been one of the more sustained episodes of internal religious violence in medieval European history. When Montségur surrendered, more than 200 Cathars walked out and were burned alive at the foot of the mountain. Others fled. Some of those who fled went into the mountains. The Pyrenean foothills of the Ariège department are folded limestone, and the limestone is full of caves, large ones, deep ones, systems that extend for tens of kilometers in passages that cold underground rivers have been carving for millions of years. One of those systems is Lombrives. It is among the largest cave systems by volume in Europe, over 50 miles of documented passage, with sections reaching ceiling heights of 328 feet, chambers vast enough that the first explorers to map them had difficulty establishing the boundaries of what they had entered. The darkness in the deepest chambers is total, the kind that doesn't feel like the absence of light. It feels like the presence of something else. The Crusaders found the entrance. René Nelly, historian of Cathar theology and co-author of the foundational study Le Phénomène Catharé, published in 1953, documented the tradition. Crusader forces located the cave entrance at Lombrives, identified it as sheltering Cathar refugees, and sealed it with masonry. This is the crucial detail. The people inside did not seal the entrance. They were not conducting a retreat or a ceremony or a voluntary seclusion. The entrance was sealed from the outside by armed men who knew people were inside. 3 months, by some accounts. By others, longer. The cave did the rest. That formulation deserves to sit there for a moment. Sealing an entrance is not stabbing someone. It does not leave weapon trauma on bone. It leaves no mark on the record that a coroner reads. No cut marks on rib cartilage, no blunt force lesion on the cranium, no penetrating wound to any part of the skeleton that forensic osteology can identify and date. And for the people inside, sealed in cold, total darkness in a chamber 328 feet high, that distinction is identical in result. They died in the dark, in the cold air of the cave, over a period of days or weeks that no one who could write was present to record. The absence of weapon trauma is not evidence of mercy. It is evidence of a different method. Lombrives was explored by speleologists beginning in the 1820s, before archaeology existed as a systematic discipline. Human remains were found in the deeper chambers in the Salle du Trône and adjacent passages, but by people who were not archaeologists, using methods that were not archaeological, before any protocol for recording find spot, stratigraphy, or associated material culture had been developed. The remains were disturbed, some were removed, some were possibly lost without record. By the time forensic osteology existed as a practice, the remains at Lombrives had been handled too many times, by too many hands, without documentation. They have never received modern analysis. Jean Clots, former director of the French Ministry of Culture's Prehistoric Cave Program, conducted a survey at Lombrives in 1995 and recorded structured prehistoric deposits, cave bear, skulls, and bison engravings, consistent with deliberate Paleolithic placement rather than random accumulation. Klotz described Lombrives as one of the most chronologically layered cave sites in Europe. Paleolithic art, Neolithic ceramic deposits, Bronze Age material, medieval dead. Each era of human use pressing down on the one below it, accumulating without anyone who came later knowing what they were standing on. Cathar theology is reconstructed almost entirely from inquisitorial records, from transcripts of interrogations conducted by the same ecclesiastical apparatus that authorized its destruction. The accused described their beliefs to their accusers. The inquisitors transcribed the descriptions. The original Cathar texts were burned. The last holders of doctrines that were never independently transcribed were people who fled into these mountains after Montségur. Some of them are believed to have died in Lombrives. Whatever those individuals believed, whatever version of the world they were willing to be sealed inside a cave for, in cold darkness, over weeks, rather than renounce, is not recoverable from any surviving document. The record of what they thought exists only in the transcripts of people who were trying to end them. Lombrives is a tourist site. It has seasonal opening hours. The throne room sounds impressive on a booking website. The deeper chambers are closed. The medieval dead in those chambers have never been excavated. The one group of people who might have explained, in their own words, what they believed and why it was worth dying for, left nothing behind but the absence of weapon marks on bones that were never properly studied. Number 6. Movile Cave, February 1986. A Romanian construction worker is drilling a borehole near the Black Sea coast, outside the town of Mangalia, testing the ground for a power plant installation. The drill breaks through into a void. The void is not supposed to be there. He descends on a rope into the darkness. The air hits him before his eyes adjust to anything. It has a smell sulphurous, thick, the kind of smell your body registers as wrong before your mind has named it. The air is wrong. Hydrogen sulfide. Carbon dioxide at 2 to 3.5%. The surface concentration is 0.04%. Oxygen at 7 to 10%. The surface is 21%. A human being breathing the air of Movile Cave without respiratory protection loses consciousness in under 15 minutes. Death follows. The worker who descended into that atmosphere was fortunate to ascend from it. Christian Lascu of the Speleological Institute in Bucharest led the first biological survey beginning in 1986. What he found required multiple publications to account for fully. 48 species of fauna were identified as endemic to the cave present in Movile and found nowhere else on Earth. Not geographically rare, not uncommon, nowhere else. All of them had been evolving in the sealed cave environment long enough to produce adaptations specific to permanent darkness. Absent eyes, or vestigial eyes reduced to non-functional remnants beneath depigmented skin. Elongated sensory appendages, calibrated to navigate by touch and vibration rather than light. Reduced metabolic rates, matched to a resource-scarce environment. The cave's food web runs on chemosynthesis. The primary producers are bacteria that extract energy from hydrogen sulfide, the same gas that makes the air toxic to any surface organism that enters. No sunlight, no photosynthesis, no connection to the surface food chain. The entire ecosystem runs on sulfur, in the dark, in poison air, and has done so for longer than the human species has existed. Serban Sarbu, Thomas Kane, of the University of Cincinnati, and Brian Kinkle published the landmark biological description of Movile's ecosystem in Science in 1996, a chemoautotrophically based cave ecosystem. The paper established Movile as the only known fully isolated chemoautotrophic ecosystem on land, an ecosystem that has never required, at any point in its 5 million year history, a single photon from the sun. Fewer than 100 total entries into the cave have been made since 1986. Fewer than 30 scientists have been inside. Each entry requires full respiratory protection, maximum safe duration inside, 5 to 6 hours per visit. The cave is not difficult to access physically. It is small, relatively shallow, entered through a narrow horizontal shaft. It is difficult to enter because the atmosphere kills people. The logistical overhead of each visit, combined with risk management requirements, means that one of the most scientifically significant sites ever discovered has received less combined human attention than a single field season at most terrestrial archaeological sites. 100 entries, 30 scientists, 5 million years of biology. Most of it has not been looked at. Here is what that constraint doesn't account for. Every one of those 30 scientists entered, spent 5 hours in respiratory equipment in a confined toxic space, and left with data representing a fraction of what remains unsampled. Species have almost certainly been missed. Interactions between species, the full metabolic map of a sealed ecosystem with no solar input, remain undescribed. The cave has been scientifically confirmed as extraordinary. The catalog of its contents is incomplete by design. The cave's water is isotopically anomalous. The hydrogen and oxygen isotope ratios in Movile's water are inconsistent with modern precipitation falling on the surface above. The water has been disconnected from the surface hydrological cycle for the same 5 million years the cave has been sealed. The water and the air and the organisms all share the same sealed history. They have been down there together, in the dark, evolving around each other since the Miocene. Constanza County is ancient Tomis, the Roman port city where the Emperor Augustus exiled the poet Ovid in 8 CE, and where Ovid spent the last decade of his life writing letters begging permission to return to Rome. The letters were not answered. Ovid died in Tomis in approximately 17 CE. Movile Cave was there the entire time, under the ground outside the city walls, sealed, full, evolving. The bacteria kept oxidizing sulfur. The blind crustaceans kept navigating dark water by the receptors in their elongated legs. Ovid wrote his Tristia and his Epistulae ex Ponto above them, and they were not aware of it, and he was not aware of them, and the drill broke through in 1986. NASA and ESA formally cite Movile Cave as a primary analog site for research into subsurface life on Mars and Europa, Jupiter's ice-covered ocean moon. The reasoning is direct. If a fully independent, isolated, chemo-autotrophic ecosystem can sustain itself for 5 million years in sealed toxic darkness on Earth, then the assumptions about what life requires, sunlight, surface connection, photosynthesis, require revision. Whatever lived on Mars, if anything lived on Mars, might look like what is in Movile right now. In the dark, eating sulfur, with no eyes, waiting for a drill that has not come yet. Number 7. Cave of the Seven Sleepers. Surah al-Kahf is the 18th chapter of the Quran. Verse 25 states that the sleepers remained in the cave 300 years, and add 309 years. The surah does not name the cave, does not specify a location, does not name the sleepers. It describes a group of young men who fled persecution by sheltering in a cave, fell into a divinely induced sleep, and awoke to find that centuries had passed. The story is presented as a test of faith. The point is not the geography, the point is the miracle. At least 6 sites across the Middle East and Mediterranean have been identified, at various points in history, as the authentic location of the event. Ephesus, now the archaeological site at Selkuk in western Turkey, is the most extensively documented. Franz Miltner of the Austrian Archaeological Institute conducted excavations there in the 1920s and 1930s, published in Ephesos, Stadt der Artemis und des Johannes in 1937. What the excavations revealed was a Roman rock-cut tomb complex, dating to the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE chambers carved from the limestone hillside to serve as a burial site under Roman administration. The stone is pale, almost cream-colored in the sunlight, the carved niches still holding the proportions of the bodies they were cut for, deep enough to require a lamp to see the back wall. In the 5th century CE, under the Emperor Theodosius II, the complex was converted into a Christian martyrion, a sacred site dedicated to Christian martyrs, with vaulted construction, Christian iconography inscribed over the Roman surfaces, and the beginning of a pilgrimage tradition that would persist for 1,000 years. Inside the converted complex, hundreds of graves, accumulated across 10 centuries. Christian burials from the Byzantine period. Ottoman Muslim burials from after the Ottoman conquest of Anatolia. Byzantine and Ottoman grave goods and inscriptions layered against each other in the same chambers. The site was used simultaneously or in close alternating succession for Christian and Muslim prayer across centuries when Christian-Muslim relations in Anatolia were organized primarily around military conflict. People came to the same cave in the same years to petition different figures for different miracles and left graves in the same limestone. The legend of the sleepers predates the Quran. Jacob of Sarug, a Syrian bishop, writing in the early 6th century CE, composed a verse homily on the 7 sleepers. Gregory of Tours included the account in his Gloria Martyrum in the late 6th century. Both Christian sources are specific. 7 Christian youths, persecuted under the Emperor Decius circa 250 CE, sealed themselves in a cave near Ephesus to avoid forced idol worship, fell asleep through divine intervention, and awoke under Theodosius II, approximately 190 years later. They are named in the Christian versions. They emerge, verify the miracle to the emperor, and die peacefully, having demonstrated the reality of bodily resurrection. The Quranic version names nobody. It specifies no location. It doesn't mention Christianity or the Roman Empire. The number of sleepers is left deliberately ambiguous. Some say 3, some say 5, some say 7, say, "My Lord knows best their number." The Islamic and Christian versions of the same story are not compatible in their theological claims. They share a narrative structure, sleep, cave, miraculous duration, and they share nothing else. Not the theology, not the geography, not the identifiable historical actors. 2 incompatible miracle traditions. 1 cave, overlapping centuries of prayer. The graves in the central chamber predate every version of the story by at least 2 centuries. The Romans who were buried there died under emperors who had never heard the legend that would later make their tomb a pilgrimage destination. They are the literal foundation of the site. They are beneath every Byzantine mosaic, every Ottoman inscription, every pilgrimage candle ever lit in those chambers. Ottoman administrative records from the Selçuk site document Muslim and Byzantine Christian pilgrims using the same cave complex simultaneously, performing different prayers, addressing different miraculous figures, in the same physical space. 3 distinct religious traditions have claimed the cave as a site of miraculous significance. None of those claims reference the actual inhabitants of the cave at the time of initial use, because the actual inhabitants were Roman pagans whose identities were neither recorded nor preserved. The sleepers' identities have been overwritten 3 times. The bones in the cave predate every version of the story. The cave does not know which version is correct. It has been holding the remains of people whose names it never had, in rock-cut chambers that were built for them and then repurposed before anyone remembered who they were. Number 8. Chauvet-Pont Cave, December 18, 1994. Jean-Marie Chauvet, Eliette Brunel Deschamps, and Christian Hilaire are following a cold draft of air through a limestone cliff in the Ardèche Gorge. Cold air moving through rock means a void behind it. They clear the passage and break through. The walls are covered in paintings. The first image Brunel Deschamps identifies in the torchlight is a woolly rhinoceros, rendered in charcoal. It has shading. Not outline shading. The use of shadow to indicate the 3-dimensional volume of the animal's body. Whoever made it understood that a drawn surface can suggest a form that recedes away from the viewer. That understanding produced a technique that would not re-emerge with consistency in European art for approximately 30,000 years. The site was examined by Jean Clotes and colleagues and published as the Chauvet Cave by Thames and Hudson in 1996. Radiocarbon dating by Valadas and colleagues, published in Nature in 2001, established the oldest dates for the paintings at 36,000 to 37,000 years before the present using AMS accelerator, mass spectrometry, on charcoal samples taken directly from the painted surfaces. The dates have been contested, refined, and extended across multiple subsequent studies by the Chauvet-Pont multidisciplinary research team under Dominique Baffière and later by Gilles Tosello and colleagues. They have not been overturned. 420 animal figures: woolly rhinoceros, mammoth, lions, cave bears, horses, aurochs, cave hyenas, panthers, owls, reindeer, a human hand stencil, geometric signs, dots, lines, handprints in ochre and charcoal, and one composite figure, part human, part bison, the kind of thing you'd expect from a civilization that had been making art for 10,000 years, not one that had apparently just started. The compositions involve grouped figures in spatial relationships to each other, predators in formation, rhinoceros, facing rhinoceros arrangements, suggesting the panels were conceived as visual units rather than accumulated marks. The technical anomalies accumulate faster than comfortable explanations. Pre-scraped wall surfaces. The artists removed the calcium carbonate layer from the rock before applying pigment, creating a smooth ground that made the paint adhere cleanly to the stone. Multiple legs on a single animal to suggest motion, a technique that anticipates film by 36,000 years. Grouped compositions functioning as visual narrative. Perspective. Figures shown at angles, indicating the artist understood how objects appear differently depending on the viewer's position relative to them. None of these techniques appear with greater frequency or earlier dates anywhere in Europe for the next 20,000 years. The artists at Chauvet were not the beginning of a technical progression. They appear in the record as an apex. What followed them, for an extended period, is technically simpler. In one chamber, not the largest, not the most decorated, a cave bear skull has been placed on a large, flat, water-deposited limestone boulder. The boulder is roughly 5 feet across. The skull is centered on it, facing outward, in the way that a deliberate placement faces outward, not the way a discarded object rests. It is the only object on the boulder. Jean Klotz, who has spent more time in more decorated Paleolithic caves than any researcher alive, described the placement in the 1996 publication as clearly intentional. There is no functional explanation. It is not a convenient storage location. It is not a refuse deposit. A cave bear skull unwieldy, heavy was carried to this specific boulder and placed in the center of it. That is the entirety of what the record contains. The skull has not moved. The rhinoceros has shading. The lions are in perspective. The technique is compositionally superior to anything in the same medium for the next 20,000 years. That sentence does not have a comfortable resolution. The cave was sealed by rockfall approximately 23,000 years ago. The sealing was total. No subsequent human occupation, no deterioration from visitor respiration across centuries of visitation. The paintings are the best preserved Paleolithic art in the world as a result. This sounds like a gift until you consider what the sealing implies. Chauvet is the only cave from that period in that condition. Every other cave from 36,000 BCE that may have existed with comparable paintings was opened, or collapsed, or degraded, or simply has not been found. The conclusions drawn about the cognitive capacity of Homo sapiens 36,000 years ago rest substantially on one sealed accident of geology. Werner Herzog filmed it in 2010 for Cave of Forgotten Dreams, the only documentary ever authorized inside the cave. Public access has never been granted and will not be. The sample size is 1. The bear skull on the boulder has not moved. Nobody has explained it. Number 9. El Castillo Cave. 40,800 years before the present. That is a minimum. The uranium-thorium date is on the calcite crust overlying a red disc painted on the cave wall. The calcite grew over the painting. The painting is older than what is covering it. How much older is unknown. Alistair Pike of the University of Bristol led the dating program published in Science in 2012. The U-series methodology works by measuring the decay ratio of uranium to thorium in calcite that has grown over a painted surface. Because uranium is soluble in water and thorium is not, newly deposited calcite contains uranium but no thorium, and the ratio advances at a known rate from the moment the calcite begins forming. The date produced is for the calcite. The paint must predate the calcite. The red disc at El Castillo has a minimum age of 40,800 years. The hand stencils on the same walls carry minimum ages of 37,300 years. Pike and colleagues stated their conclusion explicitly in the 2012 paper. The earliest dates imply that either modern humans arrived in Europe earlier than currently believed, or that the art was made by Neanderthals. That sentence appeared in Science. It has not been retracted. It has not been resolved. Neanderthals were present in Iberia between approximately 45,000 and 37,000 years before the present. Modern humans began arriving in the region during roughly the same interval. The minimum date for the oldest paintings at El Castillo, 40,800 years, falls within the period when both species occupied the peninsula and at or before the currently accepted dates for a modern human presence sufficient to produce organized cultural activity. If any painting at El Castillo predates modern human arrival in northern Iberia by even a few centuries, the author is, by exclusion, not human. Dirk Hoffman and colleagues, including Pike, published a second study in Science in 2018, applying the same UTHAF methodology to carbonate crusts at 3 other Iberian cave sites, La Pasiega, Ardalis, and Maltravieso. The minimum dates at those sites exceeded 65,000 years, well beyond the arrival of modern humans in the region by any current estimate. Hoffman's conclusion was direct. The art at those sites was made by Neanderthals. The methodology was identical to the one used at El Castillo. The 2018 study did not answer the question it raised about El Castillo. It made it more urgent. If Neanderthals were producing organized mark-making at 65,000 years at 3 other sites, the 40,800-year minimum at El Castillo is not evidence against Neanderthal authorship. It is consistent with it. El Castillo contains the panel of hands, 50 or more stencils in red ochre and black charcoal, overlapping and adjacent. Hands pressed flat against the cave wall with pigment blown around them through a tube, the mark produced by pressing your palm to cold limestone. Sealing the edges, forcing air and pigment through a narrow bone or reed until the spray settles on the stone and your hand lifts away, and the negative is there. The panel of discs, 26 or more red discs, arranged in rows and clusters, with no obvious representational content marks that are clearly intentional, clearly organized, and which have resisted definitive interpretation for a century. Animal figures across multiple chambers, bison, horses, deer, in at least 3 stratigraphic occupation phases, from the Acheulean through the Upper Paleolithic, making El Castillo the site with the longest continuous record of human and pre-human occupation in northern Iberia. Hermilio Alcalde del Rio, a schoolteacher from Torrelavega, documented El Castillo in 1903. Access to the cave became progressively restricted after the 1990s, when carbon dioxide accumulation from visitor respiration was shown to be causing measurable deterioration of the calcite surfaces at the nearby Altamira Cave. El Castillo was awarded UNESCO World Heritage status in 2008 as part of the Cave of Altamira and Paleolithic Cave Art of Northern Spain designation. Current access is sharply limited. The panel of hands is not a tourist feature. But here is what that framing doesn't fully address. The hand stencil is the most legible mark in the Paleolithic catalog. It doesn't require interpretation in the way that animal figures or geometric signs do. It is the trace of a body, a specific individual who pressed their hand flat against limestone and forced pigment around it and produced a record that says, "I was here, I had this shape, I existed at this moment." The gesture is so elementary that a child performs it without instruction. Someone performed it in that cave 37,300 years ago. The mark survived. The question of who performed it was not asked until 2012. The question has not been answered since. 40,800 years. That is a minimum. The crust covering the painting was that old. The painting itself is older. We don't know by how much. The hand is anonymous. It has been anonymous for at least 40,800 years. The field has not reached consensus. The mark remains. Number 10. Cueva de los Tallos, August 1976. Neil Armstrong descends into a cave in the Ecuadorian Amazon. This is not a metaphor and not a misattribution. Neil Armstrong, the first human being to walk on the surface of another world, whose footprints remain on the moon because the moon has no weather to erase them, descends on ropes into a cave entrance in the Cordillera del Condor, accompanied by approximately 200 personnel. British Army engineers, Ecuadorian military forces, a multinational scientific team organized across disciplines: botanists, geologists, archaeologists, zoologists. It was the largest cave expedition in recorded history by personnel count at the time of its execution. The expedition produced a report of approximately 1,000 pages. It has never been fully published. Los Tallos takes its name from the oilbirds, Steatornis carapensis, Los Tallos in regional Spanish, that nest in large colonies inside the cave. The birds navigate in total darkness by echolocation and harvest the fruit of the surrounding forest nocturnally. They have been harvested in turn by the Shuar people of the Morona Santiago province for centuries, collected from the nests as nestlings, rendered for their fat, which has a high caloric value, and used as a food source across generations of Shuar occupation in the region. The Shuar relationship to Cueva de los Tallos is not touristic. The cave is embedded in Shuar cosmology as an entrance to the underworld. The deeper passages are not places a member of the Shuar community enters without purpose. The elders have been consistent on this point across every documented encounter with outside researchers. The expeditions are looking for the wrong thing. The 1976 expedition was organized partly in response to a claim made in 1973 by Eric von Daniken in his book Gold of the Gods. Von Daniken attributed the original revelation of the cave's deeper contents to a Hungarian-Ecuadorian explorer named János Moric, who had, in 1969, filed a notarized declaration with the Ecuadorian government asserting his status as first registered claimant to a discovery he called the Metal Library. Thousands of engraved metal plates stored in artificially constructed chambers deep in the cave, containing a record of pre-flood civilization. Von Daniken's account of personally visiting the library was later retracted. He acknowledged he had not been there. Moric maintained the declaration was genuine. The 1976 expedition was organized, in part, to investigate. What the 1976 expedition confirmed archaeologically was more specific than the metal library and less spectacular: ceramic deposits. Carved niches in the cave walls, described in the expedition's internal logs as consistent with deliberate construction rather than natural formation. Evidence of sustained pre-Columbian occupation, consistent with the Shuar historical record of the cave's use. The carved niches attracted particular attention in expedition documentation. Stanley Hall, the British organizer, described in subsequent interviews features of the cave that did not fit any known archaeological category in the region. Hall spent the following decades attempting to organize a return expedition. He died in 2008. The 1,000-page report was never released in full. But here is what that framing doesn't fully address. The cave has changed since 1976. Richard Corfield, leading a BBC-affiliated expedition in the early 1990s, and independent research teams visiting in 2012 encountered a different cave than the one the 1976 expedition had mapped. The Cordillera del Condor is seismically active. Passages accessible in 1976 have been closed by rockfall, sediment movement, and hydrology since that date. The interior has changed. Sections that exist in the 1976 expedition documentation cannot be verified or refuted against current physical conditions, because the physical conditions are no longer the same. Whatever was there or was not there in 1976 exists now only in a report that has not been released. The cave rearranged itself. The report stayed sealed. What the niches contained, and what they were built for, and who built them, and when those questions sit in both an unreleased document and a physically altered cave at the same time. The largest cave expedition in history, 200 personnel. Neil Armstrong, a 1,000-page report, never published. The man who organized it spent the rest of his life trying to go back. He died in 2008. The cave is still there. Armstrong was asked in later interviews why he participated. His answer, as recorded, was that he found caves scientifically interesting and the expedition scientifically reputable. He made no claims about the metal library. He made no statements about the carved niches. He descended into the cave, and he ascended, and the report was written, and the report stayed in files that have not been opened to the public. Armstrong's footprints are still on the moon. The moon has no weather. They will be there for millions of years. The report from Cueva de los Tallos is in a file. The cave is in a different physical configuration than it was when the report was written. The question it was written to answer has not been answered. These 10 caves span 40,000 years of human and pre-human activity across 4 continents, 3 collapsed civilizations, and at least one discovery that may permanently revise what we mean when we say we understand the past. The things left inside them, the bones, the paintings, the sealed reports, the blind organisms eating sulfur in the dark, are not anomalies. They are the record. We are still reading it. If you watched this far, subscribe. Leave a comment with which of these caves stayed with you most and where you're watching from. It helps more than you think.